Hi, everybody. My name is Regina Hawkert. I'm joined by Hannah Heath, and Raina Knowles unfortunately couldn't be here for the recording of this presentation, but we are part of the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly, and we're here to give you a presentation on accessible language usage and communication. All of our slides are green with white and gold accents in writing, and we are going to be providing verbal image descriptions as we go along to make sure everybody has access. Okay, my pronouns are she, they. I have long brown hair. I'm wearing a black shirt, and I have some white walls behind me. So let's get started. Okay, so to start off with our presentation schedule, first we're going to talk about plain language usage with a little practice session. Then we're going to talk about some accessible file types, captioning, live transcripts, and some accessible images with some contact info at the end if you have any questions or you want some further information. To start off, plain language usage is described as writing and speaking in a clear, simple, and straightforward fashion. So this is super beneficial for people with cognitive disabilities, neurodivergent people, English language learners, and everyone across the board. Using plain language and making sure that things are written in the most straightforward and easy way to understand them just gives accessibility to everybody and helps everyone understand what's going on and have equal access.
Hi, everybody. My name's Hannah Heath. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I use identity first language. I'm wearing an orangish yellow shirt, and I have black short hair with like a pink streak in the front, and I have just some various artwork and books in my background. So, first off, we're gonna talk a little bit more, give like a more specific example and description of plain language guidelines and accessible communication guidelines. Some guidelines for plain language is to use common everyday words. The idea behind this being that it can be really inaccessible to use large words, especially in writing, because this can be really difficult for dyslexic people. And it can also be generally inaccessible to people who don't speak English as a first language. So it has a lot of benefits for a lot of different types of people. Um, it's also best that you do not use metaphors or abstract language. This can be really difficult for neurodivergent people. It's very inaccessible. So just use words, basically say what you mean and mean what you say is kind of a really good rule of thumb for this. Next, you want to make sure that you always state your main points first, as if you're forming a thesis statement. This goes for writing, but also when you're just verbally speaking. This has a lot of benefits. One being that it really helps orient people. So people with cognitive disabilities can kind of orient themselves and know what's going to be communicated with them ahead of time. It's helpful for people with chronic fatigue because you might start talking to them or they might start reading something that you've written and just really have no idea where you're going, and it takes a lot of energy for them to kind of continue and follow your train of thought. So just stating things up front is great. Next, when writing, is to use short paragraphs with single topics. So the single topics is really similar to what I just spoke about stating your main points first. It just keeps things really succinct, and it helps people stay focused and understand what it is that you're communicating. The short paragraphs is really helpful for people with learning disabilities, such as dyslexia, and it can also help people with ADHD. One of the worst things you can do is send somebody just a really long block of text. It's bad for dyslexia, it's bad for ADHD, and frankly, even for people who are non disabled, nobody really wants to read that. So just keep it short as possible. Next is to put important information and call to actions in bold. And it's important to note that it should be bold and bold only. You don't ever want to be using italics because this is really difficult for people with dyslexia. You don't ever want to be using like neon highlighting because this can trigger sensory overload for some people. So just use bold. And the purpose behind this is that it helps orient people, and it's really helpful for people who need to kind of sift through information quickly. For example, if somebody has chronic pain, they don't want to have to reread what you've written multiple times searching for information, as this is just expending a lot of energy that they could be using for symptom management. So that's not great. So that will help minimize the amount of energy that people are having to use to understand what you're communicating. Now, plain language is a subset of accessible communication. So there's accessible communication in plain language. So accessible communication includes everything that I just talked about as far as plain language. The first accessible communication guideline is to state clear expectations. So you want to always list the length and location of your meeting. The length is important to mention because people with disabilities have to manage their symptoms in different ways. So they might have doctor's appointments, they might have to take medications at specific times, they might have to take breaks at specific times or stretch out at specific times. So listing the length does help people know how to plan ahead to best make the meeting as accessible as possible to themselves. And you also want to list the location because sometimes the location might not be accessible to people. Hopefully, you will check that ahead of time, but sometimes somebody's access needs might not be known to you. So, listing the location allows people to look this up ahead of time and make sure that they will be able to access the space that you're meeting in. And it's also really helpful for people with anxiety because listing length and location just helps them know what they're getting into ahead of time, and this can kind of help alleviate some anxiety. Next is to put your date in multiple formats. So we have an example of that here. You want to put both the written form and the numerical form. The reason being that this numerical form can be really difficult for people with dyscalculia, but the written form can be difficult for people with dyslexia. So if you do both, it's accessible to both people. Along the same lines, you want to use abbreviations correctly. So always list the entire term and then put the abbreviations in parentheses. So Disability Resource Center in parentheses, DRC. There are a lot of reasons for this. One being that if you list just the abbreviation, some people with cognitive disabilities or processing disabilities might not be able to easily recall what an abbreviation stands for, and some abbreviations you can't really easily look up. So this kind of circumvents that problem. Next is to use closed captions, live transcripts, and accessible images and files. We're going to get into what this means exactly, but in general, the purpose behind this is to make sure that all of your information is accessible to those who are deaf or hard of hearing, who are blind or low vision, or who have different visual and auditory processing needs. And last but not least is to always establish a clear line of communication. Tell people who they can contact if they have questions about a meeting or an event. This allows people to know who they can contact if they need to set up different types of accommodations that they might require. And again, is helpful for people with anxiety because they know who they can contact and they know that they are allowed to contact people if they have questions rather than having to wonder if that's something that is okay for them to do. So that's helpful. All right, so I know that was just a lot to throw at you, so we're going to try some practice. So here's an inaccessible email that we wrote in an intentionally inaccessible way. I want you to take a couple minutes to pause, read this email, and try to count as many things that have been done incorrectly as possible. So figure out what has been done incorrectly, and then figure out how you would go about correcting this to be an accessible email rather than an inaccessible one.
For those who need a verbal image description, I will read the email out loud to you. The email reads, I am emailing about our Accessible Comm training for ASI. We will be presenting on 01/12/2021. We will start at 6:10 p.m. When during winter break would you like to meet to plan this training? Please reply all with meeting dates and times that work for you. End email. Please note that the second sentence, which reads, we will be presenting on 01/12/2021, is in italics and is also highlighted in neon yellow.
All right, so here's an example of that email rewritten in an accessible way. There are quite a few ways to rewrite this email in an accessible way, so if this doesn't exactly match what you have, that's okay, just as long as it includes some of the things we're going over. So you can see first up here, we've separated this email out to be in short paragraphs. So rather than being a single block of text, it's now more accessible to those who are dyslexic. We've done the date in multiple formats so that it's learning disability friendly. We've bolded our call to actions so that people can easily and quickly tell what it is that they're supposed to do. Next, we've stated clear expectations. So we've mentioned how long the meeting is for. We've also mentioned where it is going to be, which is on Zoom. We also went and mentioned accessibility that we are making available to people. So we mentioned that because it is on Zoom, we are offering live transcripts so that this meeting will be accessible to people who need live transcripts. And last, we did establish a clear line of communication so that people knew who they could contact if they had additional questions about this meeting. So that's kind of a way to go about writing accessible emails. As you can see, it's not difficult. It doesn't take much more time than this email back here. So it's not that much longer. And we did just kind of remove a couple of things, like we didn't do italics, we didn't do highlighting, and just added extra details. And honestly, this helps everyone involved. It saves everyone a lot of time because there's not a lot of people aren't going to be sending you as many follow-up emails because you have been cleared to begin with. So it's just helpful all around. All right, so we mentioned earlier accessible file types. So accessible file types basically, it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean converting files into an audio format. It can mean taking just scanned PDFs and converting them into what's called tagged PDFs, which means you can have that PDF be searchable using Control F. You can easily highlight and copy and paste information from that document, and different forms of assistive technology like screen readers can easily access that information. So here at Cal Poly, we have this really great free resource that converts inaccessible files into accessible ones. So what you do is you go onto the Robert E. Kennedy Library website, you go to the Study Spaces and Text slide, and then all the way down the drop-down menu, it says Convert a File. You click on that, and it's going to take you to this screen. And then basically you just upload whatever file it is that you're trying to convert. It'll convert it into audiobooks, ebooks, even digital braille, which is really cool. It'll also convert inaccessible files, like I was talking about scanned PDFs. It'll convert those into more accessible formats as well. And it's great for people who may need improved text accessibility. Or even, so it can be great for dyslexic people because you can convert it into an audio format. Can be great because it makes documents accessible to people who need screen readers, so people who are blind or low vision. It has a lot of really cool functionalities, so we encourage you to check that out.
Awesome. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about captioning and live transcripts. So who benefits from captioning and live transcripts? The list is truly everyone, but especially people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people with audio processing symptoms, English language learners, and then all sorts of people with various other symptoms and non-disabled people alike. Having a resource that you can go back and look at, or having the text with you while the meeting is happening or the event is happening is very beneficial. Up on the screen, we have some of the more prominent, live transcripts and captioning services. Otter AI is a really great one, but can be sometimes harder to access if you don't have financial means or if you're not registered to receive access from it. PowerPoint has free live transcripts for when you're presenting, and Zoom also through Cal Poly has transcripts powered by Otter. And so I believe we have more resources about how to actually access all of these that will come out. But make sure that you have transcripts and captioning for your events, for your meetings. Even if you don't think it'll necessarily be beneficial to people, it always is, and it's always better to have them than to need them and not have them. And so I would also suggest having at least 2 different ways to do captioning or transcripts, because as we all know, technology doesn't always do what we want it to. And sometimes your transcript might go down or be non-functional or have some technological bugs. So always better safe than sorry, and just have a backup in case. Now we're going to talk about accessible images. So a big way that we can do accessible images is to have alt text or an image description. This allows screen readers to be able to read the descriptive that is being used for the image, giving people equal access to the images. And it can also be used for graphics and other symbols and such. This allows accessibility for blind and low vision individuals, as well as people with visual processing symptoms. And sometimes even for non-disabled people, it can help provide a backdrop or reasoning why you've included this image and the purpose of it. So like this image on the screen is of John Lee, our Cal Poly Disability Resource Center DRC assistive technology specialist, and he is instructing a student on the use of smart pen technology. And so without a alt text or image caption, this might just look like two random people in a room. And so making sure that everybody has equal access to these images and graphics that you're using. Furthermore, it's more than just alt text. There are some important things to think about when you're using images, and especially when you're asking people to interact with images. First thing to think about is don't do like distinctions between different things using only color. This is very inaccessible for a lot of people, colorblind individuals, people with visual processing symptoms, all of the above. On the right-hand side of the screen, I have put a picture of a calendar that has dates that are in red and green, and they're about the same hue, and there's no distinguishing besides color. And so this can be really, really hard for individuals to tell the different meanings between them. So you can use like shading, text, like cross-hatching, and have a legend, and just make sure that people are able to interact with your images. Make sure your images are clear and not pixelated or like photocopies or like stretched or distorted. You want to make sure that it's the clearest, best quality image you can have. Never use flashy media, just general rule of thumb, never do it. It can be very disorientating and very harmful to people with things such as epilepsy, people who can have like sensory overload, all of the above. Don't use any neons or harsh colors. And also make sure that when you're using text, have it in a clearly legible font, a large font, and make sure that you're spacing it out enough for people to read all of it. And then you also want to use a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 between like text and background stuff to make sure that things are visible and able to be read and the most accessible version of themselves that they can be.
So next up is verbal image descriptions. So you've seen us do this quite a bit throughout this presentation and others that we've given. The purpose of verbal image descriptions is to make images accessible to those who are blind or low vision by describing images clearly and within the context of their setting. So this last part is really key for verbal image descriptions. You don't ever want to be describing something too much because then it's overwhelming, but you want to be describing it enough so that it's helpful. So, for example, off to the right, we have some clip art of a woman who's smiling and signing hello in ASL. So, for the purpose of this presentation, that's the only verbal image description that I need to give because it tells you basically what's happening without going too into detail because I'm not giving a presentation on ASL. That being said, if this was a presentation on ASL, I would want to go way more into detail than that. I would want to say, there's a woman and she's holding her right hand up to her right eyebrow, and then she's flipping her hand out, and then just making sure that I'm going really into detail about what she's doing. So that way, people who are trying to learn ASL who are blind would be able to understand what it is that I'm describing so that they could then learn how to sign this. So you really want to think about why am I using this image, what am I trying to communicate, and make sure that you communicate that and only that. You don't need to do any more, but you don't want to do any less. All right, and that is it for our presentation. If you want to learn more about disability and accessibility or resources available to disabled students at Cal Poly, you can follow the Disability Coalition of Cal Poly on Instagram. You can also check out our video description below to find more resources about accessible communication.